Getting busted doing graffiti has probably always been a really lame experience. And given that I first got involved in graffiti almost 30 years ago and I'm presently involved now, from my perspective, what's been the progression that I've seen of how graff has been treated and how it's been punished from those times leading up to now? When I first got involved in graffiti, the consequences for getting busted seemed incredibly serious, and we took avoiding getting busted incredibly seriously as well. And in terms of the things that led us to have this mentality, a lot of it was the messaging that we got from society. Graffiti and graffiti writers had an absolutely terrible reputation. Tagging was looked at as vandalism, it definitely wasn't looked at as art, and even the more artistic writers out there were looked at as criminals by a lot of people. And in this period when a lot of us hadn't started writing yet, the only people that we'd ever hear about graffiti from were authority figures. This means teachers a lot of time, and it also means the police who would come by and speak to us in class. And the messaging from these authority figures was always very straightforward and easy to understand. And they would just outright tell us, if you get busted doing something like this, you're gonna be in some very serious trouble. And I don't know about everybody else, but I always kept that in mind. I knew that if I got busted, there was gonna be consequences, and I wanted to avoid them as much as possible. So just in my day-to-day practice of graff, I tried to avoid doing very overtly hot stuff. But tagging on a locked, moving bus with the bus driver still in it is very much a hot thing to do, but there was other things that people were doing that seemed very over the top, and it looked like if I did something like that, I was gonna get busted outright. So when me and my friends were going out there catching tags and bus hopping, we always stayed very vigilant. And we'd be on the lookout for unders in particular, undercover cops that would be on the bus, that would be dressed in plain clothes, that'd be looking out for people like us. We felt like we always saw one, and they were an obsession for us as young taggers. But despite some of the measures that we would take and some of the half measures that we would take, fools ended up getting busted anyway. And as soon as a bunch of my friends got busted all at the same time, all on the same day, I got to understand what these consequences were. And to be honest with you guys, they seem pretty light. Living the life of a bus hopper puts you on the path of having to do community service. And the most common form of community service that bus hoppers would have to do would be going to bus yards and having to buff graff. Fools would have to get up fairly early to do that. I think they had to be at the bus yards at like 7 or 8 o'clock in the morning on weekends. So fools would be going to school all day during the week, and then all day during the weekend they'd have to go buff graff, but it wasn't as whack as it sounds. And these kind of bus yard buff sessions were almost like graffiti writer day camp. If you got sentenced to community service, you're gonna meet a lot of different people. You're gonna see people that you saw up, and there might have been people that you wanted to reach out to or connect with, and they might be there right next to you washing a bus. And while the city might have felt like this was gonna be a deterrent, like fools were gonna have to go out on the weekends and wash buses and just decide not to tag anymore, that wasn't the case. And really all this did was make people less scared to get busted. But even understanding the consequences and coming to experience them didn't remove this fear entirely. And for a lot of us, it just simply comes down to us being children. A lot of us were still in that place in our lives where our parents scared the hell out of us. Like myself, a lot of the people that I tagged with had parents that were born outside the States. And discipline was physical discipline, and people would catch a whooping and people would get the crap beat out of them by their parents for getting into any kind of trouble. But there was something else out there that kept us very anxious and inspired a lot of paranoia, and that would be heroes. When situations popped off with heroes, they happened and progressed very fast. And personally, anytime I ever had a situation with a hero, I was never thinking about heroes. They weren't on my mind. I was just thinking about tagging. It was the furthest thing from me, but then suddenly I'd be faced with a hero encounter. And no matter who was the hero, if they were small, if they were tall, if they were old, if they were a woman, a man, it didn't really matter. I understood that any situation with the hero could lead to violence and could lead to me losing my life. And generally speaking, if you had to deal with the hero, you'd rather deal with the hero on the street instead of inside a locked bus. But I dealt with the hero on the street, and the guy threatened to blow my head off. And I was infinitely more worried about heroes than I was the police. Some of those cops were actually pretty cool, and some of them might even like some of the graff that they saw. But while some cops out there in San Francisco were cool people, I can't say the same about heroes, and almost by nature, no hero I ever ran into was a cool, understanding person. And in general, if I never just went all out, just hit the streets with the fury or hit a bus with the fury and tagged everything in sight, it was because I was worried about heroes and potentially having my life taken. And And up until I stepped away from the scene, this dynamic of very light consequences from the city, but potentially very grave consequences from heroes, remained the case. But in the 2000s in San Francisco, the consequences got worse. And while riders, including juvenile riders, could expect to be hit with some community service and maybe a fine in the 90s, in the 2000s, you were looking at felony charges and time inside. In the early 2000s, San Francisco was going through a very extensive process of gentrification. And more resources from City Hall were starting to be allocated towards graff and graff abatement. And the city started clamping down on people, including people I knew. And in particular, once the DA Terrence Hallinan was out of office, people got slammed with a hell of a lot heavier of sentences, and the consequences for a lot of things got more dire, including for graff. But 20 odd years later from that time, what's the situation like now? This really depends on where you live. I can say though, from what I've seen, these kind of harsher laws, these felony charges for graff, are still on the books in a lot of places. But in these same places, the enforcement of these laws seems a little lax. And when it comes to graffiti scenes all across the world, one thing in particular seems to be universal, and that is graff will flourish and expand and grow in a place where the cops don't really give a crap about it. This is probably the case in a lot of places, but in San Francisco in particular, the cops only care about what City Hall tells them to care about. And if the city hasn't provided guidance or a directive targeting graff, the cops probably aren't going to do it on their own. And as a consequence, anybody visiting San Francisco in 2025 or just seeing pictures from the city is going to see a city that's incredibly bombed. This is also the case for the city of Los Angeles, and I can personally say it's the case for Miami as well. I was in Miami at the start of January and I saw graff all over the place, especially a lot of pieces on the rooftops of buildings. I saw some big names up there in some very ostentatious and eye-catching locations, and they had to have been doing these things damn near out in the open without much of a care. And in general, I'm starting to see a lot more graffiti writers acting like this, where they're going out in broad daylight and not just catching a tag in public, fools are hitting up pieces in public without a care about whoever sees it or what they're gonna do after. I've mostly seen this on the internet, but I can say I've seen it in person as well. And back in July of last year here in Asheville, I was going to an antique store and I saw a fool busting a piece just on an old trailer. It was like maybe 2 o'clock in the afternoon. This fool didn't care. He was just hitting up, and I asked him if it was cool to hit up where he was hitting up at. He told me he didn't know, he didn't care, he saw graffiti there, so he just started doing his thing. And a lot of other writers have a similar demeanor to this dude that I met here in Asheville. And the last thing that they seem to be worried about is hero danger. And that's probably because in the last couple of decades, this kind of heroic behavior from people on the street seems to have lessened a lot. And it's just to the point now where people are just out there in their own world, focused on what they're doing and not even cognizant of anything around them. And in this current moment, especially in San Francisco in 2025, it seems like the only way to get in some trouble is to have the cops catch you in the act in the moment. But I do have to stress, this is only the case for just right now, and this is subject to change. And if the cops start giving a crap again, and graff writers don't know and they're unaware, it's gonna be a tough time for a lot of people, and there's gonna be a new round of consequences that everybody's gonna get slapped with.